Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing another Sharks player review. And this time around, we've got a player who's a bit more of a fan favorite in Nico Sturm. Now, this is a good time to try and give an update on how I have come to my grading selections for these particular videos. And this is pretty much entirely based on the grades that I gave out during the season, during my videos of the first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, and fourth quarter grading that I did. And the reason for this, compared to just giving a grade right at the end of the year, is that we can tend to fall into the trap of recency bias, where when I think of Nico Sturm, I think about what he was doing during the last month or couple of months of the season, like March and April, and forget what he may have been doing through the early parts of the season in October and November. But instead, going by the grades that I gave them after each 20-game segment of the season, it gives me a slightly more even keel view of how this player actually performed over the full 82-game year. On top of that, when it comes to the grading, it is not a clean and objective scale of how good a player is, just generally, in the NHL. If that were the case, there would not be a world in which I would have Nico Sturm actually ranked behind Mike Hoffman like I currently do. But the way that it is instead being treated here is that I have specific expectations, not very high expectations. I try to keep it very fair, relatively low for all of these players, and their grades are based on how much they may have overexceeded those expectations or underperformed to those expectations as well. So in the case of Mike Hoffman, I kept my view of him at such a low level that even though he came in and was not very good as expected, that's exactly the case. It was expected that he wouldn't be that good, and the fact that he wasn't horribly terrible is kind of what was the saving grace and got him the grade of a C. When it comes to Nico Sturm, and I'll get into this in this video, is that his expectations were not really overexceeded all that much. And so when it comes to Nico Sturm, he was a player who was acquired by Mike Grier pretty early on in his tenure as San Jose Sharks general manager. He wanted to make a splash when he came in, but of course he couldn't do so by picking up a big name in free agency. So instead he takes the Stanley Cup winner, or one of the Stanley Cup winners from that past season, off the Colorado Avalanche in unrestricted free agency, a 3-year deal at $2 million, which seemed perhaps like a slight overpay just because Nico Sturm wasn't really a valuable part of the Avalanche team when he did win the Stanley Cup. But it ended up looking quite well. Through the early parts of the 22-23 season, it seemed as though Nico Sturm was one of the only forwards for the San Jose Sharks who was actually able to score goals and contribute on the score sheet. And by the end of the season, he'd end up with 14 goals as a player who was primarily playing in a bottom six role as a fourth liner or a third liner. It was a pretty impressive output for him offensively. This past season, on the other hand, in 63 games played, he had just 5 goals and 8 assists for 13 points. That is half of the total amount of points that he had compared to last season. Now, we do have to consider the fact that Erik Karlsson is no longer on the team, and while Nico Sturm was not necessarily a frequent player who was on the ice with Karlsson, I imagine Sturm did still get to benefit from it and picked up a few extra points here or there. On the other hand, however, the quality of forwards that Nico Sturm was playing with on his line in terms of his two wingers hasn't really shifted all that much between these two seasons. Last year, he may have found himself at times with players like Nick Bonino and Matt Nieto, these types of guys. This year, he found himself with players like Luke Cunnin and Justin Bailey. I wouldn't say those players are any better or worse. And so to see him drop by half in terms of his point totals is an indication that Nico Sturm was just generally a bit worse offensively than he had been last year. But at the same time, you're not necessarily hoping and really excited for a offensive Nico Sturm here. As long as you're getting good defensive play, you're pretty satisfied with whatever goals and with whatever points he happens to be putting up. But defensively did leave a bit to be desired. Now, when he was originally acquired and throughout much of last season, I had talked about how Nico Sturm was a really good fourth liner, probably could be a solid fourth liner on most playoff teams even. But when it came to actually playing up to the third line, that started to be a bit of a stretch, and he started to have a few more issues. That wasn't the problem problem coming into this season because it was expected that the Sharks would actually have very solid center depth with Hertl, Couture, and Mikael Granlund, and so Sturm would primarily find himself on the fourth line. But of course, as we know, this didn't end up being the case because Couture missed the vast majority of this past season. So Sturm was instead put into a third line role. And while he certainly wasn't tasked with playing the big minutes this past season, as that was usually with Granlund and in the early parts of the season with Tomas Hertl, he was really only up against other teams, third and fourth lines, perhaps with the occasional shift against some really good players. And so defensively, you were expecting him to match up quite well against them, and yet, while he certainly wasn't bad, the line and the bar should be much higher when it comes to Nico Sturm. He's supposed to be quite responsible defensively, and this season he was not really better than average. And we can see that from his plus-minus. This is the argument that I used when I talked about Mike Hoffman in my previous video. Hoffman was a minus 21, which when you compare to his preseason expectations where you thought Hoffman would be horrible defensively, were actually not bad. But Nico Sturm's minus 25, while it is certainly better than a few of the players on the San Jose Sharks, you were kind of expecting slightly higher than that. Certainly nowhere near the positives, but minus 25 for a player who found himself pretty much in the bottom six the entirety of the season except near the end where he got some second line time, it is a bit lower than one would hope for. When it comes to his time on ice, 14 minutes, 39 seconds is about in line with what you would expect as Nico Sturm as a player. Like I said, he was mostly in a third line role through a good chunk of this season due to the fact that Couture was injured for pretty much the entirety of the season. And so that's a kind of third line type of time on ice, especially when you also consider the fact that Nico Sturm played a decent amount of time on the penalty kill this past season. On top of that, Nico Sturm actually also filled a very interesting role for the San Jose Sharks because of the fact that he was not only the Sharks' best face-off guy, but actually one of the best face-off guys in the entire league this past season. And so a lot of the times in certain defensive zone situations, and in particular in overtime for the first face-off of the post-regulation play, David Quinn would have Nico Sturm on the ice taking the face-off to give the Sharks the best possible chance of winning. In the overtime where puck possession is so important, having Nico Sturm take that face-off and then immediately head off the ice was something David Quinn employed multiple times. So that would obviously inflate the time on ice a few seconds here or there, and that begins to add up. And so 14 minutes, 39 seconds, about what you would expect. And so when it comes to his grading, offensively was a slight disappointment compared to last season. He dropped a good amount in terms of both goals and in terms of points. And defensively, while I can't sit here and argue that he was a defensive liability and he was all that bad, there were very few games this past season where I was actually impressed with what Nico Sturm was able to do. And as such, he ends up with the very average and middling grade of a C. Class dismissed.